Hello, I'm Alan Davies. I'm an architect and heritage lead at BDP. Welcome to the first ever BDP podcast series. It's called Old Buildings, New Beginnings. In this series, we discuss the current thinking relating to the reuse of old and existing buildings. We will discuss topics including adaptive reuse, sustainability, accessibility, improving performance, as well as the cultural significance of keeping old buildings. Why build new when you can repurpose the old? Welcome to the conversation. Hello, and welcome to Old Buildings, New Beginnings, where this week we broaden our discussion and ask the question, is the adaptive reuse of old buildings a global trend? When it comes to the reuse of buildings, do we have to be sensitive to the different circumstances in those countries where we work? How does this affect our approach, our design process, and the construction process? And how do we persuade our clients in different parts of the world of the merits of reusing existing buildings? Or is this already taking off as a worldwide initiative? With me today to discuss these questions, I have three colleagues from across BDP's global network of studios. Akshay Khera is an architect director in our Bristol studio and has also worked in our Delhi and Abu Dhabi studios. Tianyi Gu is an architect director in our Shanghai studio, who has also spent time in the UK. And Illyas Maljee is an architect associate in our Abu Dhabi studio. Welcome to you all. And I'd like to start with a question about the nature of the building stock in the parts of the world where we're working, and how that might influence the drive to reuse them or to replace them. And I guess, a good place to start on that discussion is in the Middle East and UAE. And Illyas, just outline for us the history of the area that you're working in.
Thanks, Alan. I think the UAE, I've only been here for a very short period of time, but I've come to realize that the UAE is quite a new place. From the post-Etihad period, it's from the formation of the United Arab Emirates, it's been approximately 50 years. You can compare it to probably Milton Keynes in the UK, which, we wouldn't class that as an old city. So when it comes to adaptive reuse, in the UK, you'd probably consider, if you were to consider adaptive reuse to buildings that have only been around for 20, 30 years at the most, it'd either be an insult to, either the building itself, or someone would probably ask the question to say, someone got this wrong, right? How can you reuse a building which has only been around for 20 or 30 years? So that brings me to 42 Abu Dhabi. 42 Abu Dhabi is a project which is in the Mina Zaid warehouse district, which was former warehouses for the port, for the Abu Dhabi port. And there were storage buildings. They were specifically created for storage warehouses to support the port itself. It was built around the 70s. So again, from a perspective of adaptive reuse, it hasn't been around for a long time. And 42 Abu Dhabi is quite an interesting project because given the fact that the original approach for this particular project was adaptive reuse to retain the existing building, retain the existing structure. And that's how we proceeded to design a really unique tuition center run by Ecole themselves, which is a free coding school that adopts a fascinating project-based peer-to-peer learning. It's free. So it's a really interesting approach. And the entire master plan itself is based on an educational purpose. Allows and Morrison actually were involved in the master planning of his entire district. And this project that we approached with an architectural vision to retain the structure, retain the facade as much as we can, keep the skin, keep the history, keep the 30, 40 years it's been around on the port itself, to maintain that historical value. But I like to add that the projects that I've seen in this region, when you do an adaptive reuse, many of the projects were poorly constructed or weren't constructed to the scrutiny that would probably get in European countries or the UK countries, because there was a large push to develop the industry, there's a large amount of oil money in obviously in the UAE, and to push the country to a heavy extent. Many buildings were constructed to a level where adaptive reuse probably wasn't something that people considered. It was almost something that they would approach from a perspective of demolition. Demolition was because the money isn't a shortage here, so it's not in people's understanding to reuse a building. Why would you? If you've got plenty of land, you've got plenty of money to do it. Sharjah, actually being one of the Emirates, was probably one of the first. It's about an hour's drive from Dubai. Actually, I should touch on Sharjah, and Akshay, do come in here because you probably know a little bit more about Sharjah than me. But Sharjah itself was probably the city that's probably a little bit behind in terms of modern development compared to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. However, it was probably the city that was developed the most in terms of all the Emirates. And it's just to touch on it now, I know that's not your particular, well, it is part of the question, but Sharjah itself is probably the most forward when it comes to adaptive reuse, the most forward when it comes to maintaining heritage. And probably because of the interest by the ruler in Sharjah himself, in terms of, I mean, he at this current time, he actually has a Royal Institute of British Architects advisor sitting, beside him, who advises him with all the architectural elements, whether it's refurbishment, whether it's new build, contextually master planning, etc. So he's got someone to advise him. And Sharjah was the city that developed adaptive reuse, and from that particular city, you've then got the likes of Abu Dhabi, who then followed suit.
Yeah. So is the impression that we have, I think, of the region is glistening towers and pristine new buildings. Is that inaccurate?
No, I think you're right. I think what had happened is you had the modernist movement, you had the Arabic modernist movement, which was a similar type of movement that we had in the UK. So you had this lovely pieces of architecture. Many Western architects were involved in developing the early development of the UAE. However, these particular buildings themselves, a lot of them have been demolished to date. They don't have that type of importance that we do have in the UK. So, for example, is that the understanding of adaptive reuse is not something that the architects, I'm talking about architectural practices in the UAE, as well as individuals, as well as clients. Clients do not understand adaptive reuse in this country, and they haven't.
Is that because of the existing building stock? Is it because of the recent nature of that compared with, for instance, the UK, where a great deal of our building stock, in particular, the public buildings, were built or rebuilt in the 19th century. So they are ripe for repair, reuse, adaptation. That presumably is quite different in the UAE.
It is. I wouldn't say, I mean, there are some buildings, for example, in Sharjah, there was an art foundation in Sharjah, actually. It was an interesting article that I came across, that many of the banks have actually had this adaptive reuse approach. And I guess, I mean, actually, I do come in here because, I mean, I'm sure you probably got a lot more knowledge when it comes to some of the particular buildings here. But this development, I mean, there was an arts foundation developed by a specific architect who approach the Sharjah Development Committee at that time, who were about to demolish a beautiful modernist architectural, almost like an area where you had a number of apartment buildings, you had mixed use, you had a number of shops, you had some banks, and all of this was going to be flattened for a new development. So they took this particular building. They did. There was an arts exhibition that took place in this particular building, and thereafter it was so successful that this was reversed. So therefore, the demolition of this particular area wasn't. I mean, this architect, his specific view in terms of why buildings in this region are not being reused, and he's obviously pushing for this, is just we have a large amount of land here. So we have an abundance of financial backing to develop new. So therefore, for architects to approach a project and advise the client that you can retain this particular project or you can reuse it and get a really, really useful use out of this particular building without demolishing it can also be achieved. And that attitude is changing.
Yeah. Can I ask you, Tianyi, again, just concentrating on the nature of the existing building stock? Is that suitable for adaptation and reuse? Is it, again, comparing with what Illyas has just explained about the development of the region he's working in, the comparison of the UK with 200-year-old buildings that are robustly built but can be adapted. I think when we think of China, we think of recent economic development and urbanization, and that is the big trend which is driving development and change in China. What is the nature of the existing building stock that is suitable for adaptive reuse or for refurbishment?
Hi, Alan. Yeah, thank you for the invite and for this event. A really interesting topic, and I would say certainly industrial heritage buildings are more and more becoming the key trend to suit the urbanization and the development of the China currently in the current mood. Tier 1 city, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen. We have 4 Tier 1 cities. You're talking about a population of 20 million each, roughly. And things like Guangzhou, only yesterday, 43 buildings becoming listed, and they're all industrial heritage. I think because of the urbanization, for most of these Tier 1 cities, you're talking about 60%, 65% urbanization compared with the UK. And city center now becoming, we have less and less building stocks in terms of, as well as land, to allow high density, high FAR developments. So to allow the city, municipal government, as well as district level, to the major private sector investment, they want to more influence and more impact to gain more profit. They have to move, like what Manchester did, they have to move the focus to outskirts of Shanghai and to middle ring or even further to out ring. And then, but these previously, most of these areas are in fact industry land. And it has a really high speed, motorway, high speed way area can easily to reach these areas. And they are not individually alone, build these factories. They are one next to each other. You're talking about 10, 20, 30 of them becoming a ring or half of a circle outside of the major cities. So if the city, either both private or public sector money combined together going to that area, if they found a landmark place like Shanghai Power Station, and then very easy, they can trigger a vast area of previously low value area zones to becoming mix of use. You're talking about residential, office towers, and bring metro stations, metro lines to go there, and then give a certain level of theme, such as to provide enough of support, like healthcare, sports, and cultural, and then develop these areas becomes the subcore of the Shanghai city center, let's say.
Yeah. Sorry, just to interrupt. We've worked together on projects in Chongqing.
That's a good
where
case.
Again, the drive was to preserve 20th century buildings and industrial buildings. And in that case, a lot of very good traditional courtyard housing had been lost. Is that still sounds to be the trend, that industrial buildings, 20th century buildings are being saved and kept as for their cultural as well as their historic significance. But other building types are being lost because of the need to build to greater densities. Would you say that that's a fair reflection?
That's certainly the case, Alan. And because China, relatively speaking, has a long history of modernization in terms of the architecture industry. The country was formed in 1949. You're talking about only 70 years history. Before that is 1 century of all the wars for various reasons. And also after 1949, China still suffered from 20, 30 years of different conflicts, etc. So the real estate development, the building that China was actually only started from the 1980s. So you're talking about most of the buildings you see only has 30 years to maximum 40 years history. And then, so the pencil factory becomes, very unique and of high value in the city center, and then has to protect it. But the rest of the vast of the building, they still using, people still using them. And they're not into the, and then if we go back to the further distance, I mean, you're talking about timber buildings. I mean, historically, China, which most of them doesn't even exist, unlike the UK case. I mean, people using stones rather than timber. So here, there's residential building and the industry building becoming two major areas that becoming the building stocks.
That figures. Akshay, can I ask you to draw on your experience of India and the relevance of the building stock in India to this? What are the main themes there?
So I mean, I think India is an interesting one to talk about because it's so diverse in its building stock as it is in its culture, and various parts of the country have, various, type of construction that happens there, suitable to the climate from, deserts up in the north, Himalayas further up, and a very coastal climate down in the south. So there's a fair degree of variation in construction methods, which then lend themselves to either longevity or not. Interestingly, as an overview, as you were saying earlier, there is a fair bit of older building stock, which is sort of more culturally relevant as well. The old Havelis where joint families, lived together, and those, kind of went into a more derelict condition. But instead of being demolished, they are now being, repurposed as hotels and guest houses. And, so they're kind of breathing life back into them than developers, coming around and demoing all of it and cleaning it out. So there's a big difference in attitude in that respect. Old forts are always, as they are in the rest of the world, are always converted into hotels and the like. The one interesting example, and this kind of links in with what Tianyi was saying, as I worked on a project where we were looking at new towers within an industrial estate. It used to manufacture nylon, and of course, that stopped. And the client, along with the master planner who worked, who was one of our chairs in the Delhi studio, Sham. He did the overall master plan. But interestingly, they were to keep some of the heritage of what was done in the on site, with this nylon manufacturing industry. It had these massive chimneys and these cooling towers which were used. And in the overall master plan, it was decided to keep the cooling towers and convert it into a restaurant. And with these massive concrete funnels within it. If you design a new restaurant today, you would never ever think of designing it in that way. So that's an interesting aspect where when you're reusing something, you could be experiencing a space which could be quite different from what you would normally design. And then the chimneys were kept and were converted into, we got, I think the artists were involved to, paint alongside these chimneys, and they're in the heart of the campus. So the need to retain and to keep, and these probably were about 40, 50 years old. So it wasn't 100 or 150 years old, but to keep some of that character and history and what was done and why it was done, that thread going through even a new development is gaining ground. And the last thing I'll say is from a sustainability aspect, of course, reuse and remodel is one aspect of it. But the other thing that is catching up in India is improvement of the fabric of the building. Relooking at more energy efficient ways to implement, which would then help on the sustainability side of it. So that's another thing which is being looked into, that let's not just demolish, let's see how we can improve the fabric or improve the efficiency of the building to make it more sustainable. And warehouses are also being converted into restaurants and F&B type spaces, because they're open plan. They lend themselves most to anything coming in, and because they have a reasonable height in them, the possibility of inserting mezzanine floors and things like that, is also taking ground in India. So, yeah.
What about policies? Do you think the policies in the regions you're working, whether they're economic policies or sustainability policies, do they lead to reuse, or do you think the policies are less geared to reuse and more towards, let's say, economic development or other goals? If I can start with you, Tianyi.
From policy perspective, I think China is, how should I put it, a single party. So from Beijing central government's policy, normally it's fairly easy to be exacted to province level and to city level and then to district level. And I remember 2 months ago when I was still working on at the time when we attending meetings for the power station project, there was a new policy released from central Beijing government emphasizing on that all the existing building need to be protected more once they're listed. And the reason being that is some of the central government realized in some of the cities and regions, private sector developers tend to be overly focusing on the profit when they are doing the developments. So Beijing central government obviously try to gear and guide the trend for the developments in the major cities. So it can see from Shanghai studios project-wise, we can very easily sense that the policy becomes more and more strict and tighter. A month ago, we worked with the Vanke, the largest developer in China, in Shanghai city center. They tried to call it Jingling Road development, and it's a residential quarter, and to allow this very old 2-story single block to be developed into fully functioned, mixed functions, different usage. We need to do a lot of amendment to the, especially let's say ground level, and to open more permeability into the center of the block. Previously, retail only happens at the on the edge, but nothing happens in the middle apart from residential function. But now we have to change it, so we have to increase the permeability. But from policy perspective, clearly we feel that there's a lot of it becomes difficult, but in a way that also means to protect it. It's a heritage and conservation perspective. They clearly, from national to regional to local, they all want to preserve as much as they can in terms of a structure, elements, windows, walls, and roofs, tiles, becoming more and more. I would say becoming more and more like a UK experience.
So conservation policy is evolving and maturing, would you say?
It is indeed. Previously, such type of developments, the planning approval was to the planning approval chop need to given by the planning department. But now, for key region, for key buildings, the planning approval chop will be provided by the conservation department, not the planning department anymore. So you can see that from top down, the major change for that.
And do you think the reason for that is cultural? Is it because of the cultural value that these buildings have, or is it because of sustainability policies? Which is driving?
It's certainly the cultural. It is certainly the cultural, both domestic and industry as well.
Can I put that to Akshay with your combined experience? Do you think that's the same in India and the MENA area?
Yeah, so I think I'll probably bring a bit of UK into it as well, to give it some context. So, so there are two aspects to it, aren't there? There are guidelines that one needs to, adhere to. So for example, in the UK, if we are looking at net zero, not just from a government level, but from a client level. So, we're working with universities whose aim is to be carbon neutral by 2030, for example, right? So it's a client-driven, which of course piggybacks on the overall targets. But the minute you've said, yes, we want to be net zero or carbon neutral, you're automatically, it's not then just a question of policy, it's a question of how do you achieve it? And it just goes straight into, it cuts to the chase that, hey, if you reuse an existing building, you're saving 70% of your embodied carbon, in the super substructure and the fabric, in case you're not updating the fabric, and you're saving 30% possibly on cost, and of course the program benefit. So it just goes straight into that kind of a discussion without reading policies.
Yeah, that is very much on sustainability. So in the UK, the heritage conservation cultural aspect is very mature. We started doing that in the 19th century in the Industrial Revolution, and the legislation we've got relating to cultural conservation matured a lot in the middle of the 20th century. So we have a long standing tradition of that, which is why places like York look like they do, because they've had 70 years of conservation. But the sustainability argument is wider. It relates to a lot more buildings which we may not consider to have much cultural value, but have an inherent value in terms of embodied energy and so on. So that's certainly true in the UK. And India, is there anything different or unique about the experience in India?
I think again in India it's quite heritage is extremely important, and there is a lot of it through different eras as well, and it is very important to preserve it and conserve it. And over the last 10 or 15 years, every time I do travel back, and you can see the amount of effort being put into improving older heritage structures, and there is a pride in having them, and keeping them that way. So that's always been there, and the conservation architects are, and there's a lot of input even from the Indian Institute of Architects or the Council of Architects, who always make sure that they've got a voice in anything that is changing. For example, very recently there was a big furore about one of Louis Kahn's hostels that he'd built for the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad to be brought down, and there was a push that went up to the courts, and I believe the building was saved, and it wasn't demolished. So those are the kinds of things which show that that if you have that concerted effort, and the need to save something, then it will be, and people want to. Now, interestingly, on the UAE side of it, again, it's all relative. As Illyas was saying, it was 1971 is when the UAE was formed per se, and one of the first commissions which was for the Cultural Foundation building, which was done. Which was designed by, it was like the Bauhaus sort of school, Marcel Breuer's, kind of a, I think it was called I forget the name, the Architects Collaborative, which was founded by Walter Gropius, and it was built in 1981, and what was really interesting is that it has got that sort of, it's that modern sort of architecture quality, and when the master plan for Qasr al-Hasan, the fort, and the new build, next to it was done, this was such an important piece of it, and it was remodeled. It was given a new lease of life internally, and that shows that there is, especially in Abu Dhabi, I think, which is like considering itself to be the cultural capital as well in comparison to Dubai, to retain all of this and to keep it is very important.
Just touching on Akshay's point about some of the modernist era and some of these important buildings, they are far and few between. We don't see many of them. The vast majority, I mean, when we do see them, they are fascinating buildings, like Akshay has just alluded to. They are fascinating pieces of architecture. But the vast majority of the building stock that you find in this region are buildings that probably went through like what you would call the late 70s, maybe early 80s in the UK, when you had a period of just, architectural development that went, some of the buildings that you see in there where would I say? I mean, in East London, where I grew up, there was a hell of a lot of buildings during that period that have probably come down by now because they didn't meet any of the criteria of what we would call as good pieces of architecture that are timeless, that have a design which you can see it through to 100 years. I mean, that's another point that we need to consider, right? I mean, when it's adaptive reuse, if you've got a building that just doesn't meet an architectural let's say an architectural importance in terms of design. And I will tell you now, I mean, if this podcast was a video cast, I would probably turn my laptop towards the skyline of Abu Dhabi. And I think everybody would almost agree almost instantly that, I wouldn't really want to see that building being reused. I'd rather see that building come down.
I guess that brings us, I mean, those are very interesting points about the quality of buildings and when is it appropriate to adapt and reuse, and are there buildings which are beyond that they have a limited life because of the circumstances which existed when they were built. It's a subject we have touched on in the previous podcast about sustainability. So picking that up and moving it forward, I guess the question is, how do we as BDP persuade our clients in these different parts of the world of the merits of reusing buildings? Do we find ourselves having to make that argument, or are the clients now coming to us and saying, we know you do adaptive reuse. We know you understand this, both the economics of it and the cultural aspects. So in each of your regions, what is that relationship with the client, and which are the areas that we can push and say, it's worth doing this. It's worth doing this either for economic or sustainability or cultural reasons. It'd be interesting to understand where you are in different parts of the world on those issues. And I guess we can pick up first. Tianyi's already mentioned industrial buildings and developers are coming. Public sector. What about the private sector in China? Is that also a market? Is that an area where those clients understand the need to reuse buildings or not? Or is there something that we can do to persuade them?
I think they do. Private sector-wise, the clients, they do understand the value of it and the value of if they can get involved and carrying out projects like this, and the value it can bring to not just the project itself, but also to the developer themselves as a reputation-wise, because this becoming more and more trend in China for these adaptive reuse. And for example, the Chongqing project you've been working on, I mean, that is a private sector involvement, private investment go in there. And despite the power station project that's all three parties are public sector, but let's say Vanke, that's a private company. And they try to develop right in the middle of the Shanghai, these two resi blocks. But at the same time, the government, they work with the government, try to gain more, compensate, let's say, from the government. And also the government want to develop these two, how should I say, these two 100 years old resi blocks. There's no activities there. It's just a random, the unsafety, public unsafety, let's call it. And so it can see the value, the value to the contribute to the society, to the project, as well as to the company itself. And this is from the, how should I call it, the minor level, but from macro level, I would say that because of the reason, last year and the year before, the political movement around the whole China, everything, all the resources becomes more and more centralized. So I would say currently, in the current economic climate in China, it will becoming more and more public sector focused for that type of projects. I mean, this is the trend, but if we say after 5 years or 10 years, may come back again. It's a wave anyway.
Yeah, the building stock that you've described outside your window was built for a particular set of circumstances. Now, circumstances are changing, for various reasons. COVID has shown that we can work in different ways. Are those buildings still relevant? Do they need to be reimagined?
Well, the vast majority of the buildings in Abu Dhabi, in particularly in the inner city, are residential buildings or mixed-use buildings. Those buildings were probably built, again, like I said, between the late 70s to the early 90s. Very poorly constructed. Adaptive reuse, for example, for these buildings. I mean, in the time I've been here, which is just under a year and a half, I've seen 4 buildings come down locally to where I live. And I live in the heart of the city. I live in the hustle and bustle of Abu Dhabi, as you call it, as opposed to the really nice, newly modern developed residential districts surrounding Abu Dhabi. And I would, as an architect, knowing what those buildings looked like before they were pulled down, I wouldn't have any other opinion other than agreeing with whoever decided to bring them down. And a residential building, again, it was early developers that were given portions of land. If you look at I don't really want to delve into the political aspects of how land was subdivided to families and tribes within this region, because it's not my forte and I'll be doing it injustice, but that's pretty much how it happened. There was a rush of oil money that came through. There was lots of land. There was lots of people involved within that part of it who didn't understand development, who used architects who developed all sorts. And there was no policy. There was no criteria. There was no rigid development that we had. I mean, again, you can say it's similar to how we went through in the late 70s, maybe early 80s in the UK when it came to heritage. We had heritage buildings were I mean, you can speak in a lot more detail, I'm sure, Alan, but there was a lot of heritage. I worked on Cheltenham, One Bays Hill Road, which was 2 existing villas, and in the late 70s, Kraft Food, which was an American food company, took over this building, completely ripped apart the historical elements of these 2 lovely villas, put concrete slabs to work for their office infill. All the period features were taken away, and then when we came on board to completely demolish and reverse what they had done, we faced all sorts of problems. I mean, I know this is diverting off, but I might as well drop this one in. We faced almost so many problems reintroducing period features within these old villas, but then also having to deal with issues related to, for example, introducing double glazed sash windows. Right, so the conservation architect wouldn't have it. So it was like we went through a period where no one really cared about historical buildings other than the really, really, really important ones, and a lot of the historical buildings did get destroyed at a certain period of time. Whereas over here in this region, it's adaptive reuse will be the buildings like I've said, like I've described, Akshay has described in relation to the modernist era. I think those are the buildings that actually have some value. There are the buildings that actually have some importance architecturally, heritage-wise. The rest of the buildings, poorly constructed, constrained, and if you are going to reuse a existing apartment building, it's probably going to be reused as another existing apartment building. So another apartment building. So the use will be maintained. It's not going to be purpose. And residential buildings are obviously required in this region because the expat population is quite high.
Yeah. I'm going to come to Akshay to finish off with your combined experience of working in several different locations. I'm going to ask you how do you see us persuading clients to reuse buildings more for all the reasons we've discussed? Is there anything in your experience that you can share in terms of approach, that design approach, the arguments we can make for retaining existing buildings.
I think again, in the light of the whole sustainability discussion, I think that is probably comes to the fore. That's your first sort of layer as to why it is important. The second aspect, really, as Illyas was mentioning, is to do with with the belief that there is a quality in the architecture, and where it is and the context that it sits within, which makes it even more important to conserve it and reuse it, or just conserve it. It doesn't matter whether it's essentially reused. So I think those two aspects are the most important in that respect. In terms of the type of client, also has a bearing on what is important to them. So although your end game would still be to conserve it, but how you approach it has to be different based on the type of client you're speaking with, because of their goals and aspirations. You have to align it to to their goals and aspirations. So, for example, and I'll just take some simple examples which I've already mentioned previously. So when we looked at that industrial project, where we retained certain elements, there was an emotional connect. So the private developer, had that vision and had that emotional connect with what, his family or their family did, and they wanted to retain a bit of that. So if you can connect with that approach, then it is more possible to retain certain elements. If you are looking at from a developer standpoint, of course, for them, the commercial side of it is important, and what that gives you. So, for example, a lot of the the old forts that were converted, and these were kind of derelict. The government wasn't at that point doing anything for them. They were bought out by independent private developers whose sole focus was just to do that. So it wasn't a side business for them. It was something that they really wanted to put their heart and soul into. It becomes easier with those clients because they've already got that vision to be able to do that. And the third one, I think where we talked about the warehouses and things like that. Again, that is sort of more driven by entrepreneurs who want to do something different. Who want to contribute in a certain way, and again, lending itself back to sustainability, but also to coolness. It is about creating that cool, interesting, new type of space than any other standard space that they always that customers always go into. So I think it depends on the various threads that and the type of client that you're speaking with. For a government client, of course, it's going to be related to policy. That this aligns with what you are trying to achieve, and that's the reason why you need to do it.
From all of this, what I get is a sense that by keeping these buildings, we are getting that richness of character and that variety. I think, Akshay, you described buildings which you would never design in that way, being converted into restaurants or hotels, and making for unique environments. So thank you all, three of you, Illyas, Akshay, Tianyi, for your insights and for taking us to different parts of the world and different BDP studios. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you.